Hello, students. This week's lesson involved learning how to tell a story from multiple documents and also looking for perspective and bias. Who's telling the story, from what perspective, and do they have any bias? So, we learned a lot about Plains Indian culture and contrasted that with American cultural beliefs about land in the West at the time in the 19th century. And last week we started and this week we investigated people who going out onto the West, their economic activities, the homesteading, the ranching, the mining. And now we're going to see how this leads to conflict. And one early conflict happened at a place called Sand Creek. So the first thing I'm going to do is talk you through the document a little bit before you try it yourself. So I'll talk a little bit about the document and the thinking questions I pose to you before you go through it again with your question sheet. So the first document here shows the Fort Laramie Treaty Tribal Territories as of 1851. And we learned that the Fort Laramie Treaty was a treaty signed between Americans and some of the Plains tribes to regulate land use out in the West, especially to get permission from the Plains tribes to build some forts and the Transcontinental Railroad. The purple area is part of North and South Dakota, and the blue area is present-day Colorado. So you can see where some of the tribes were living at the time. And your thinking question does say, how many states are covered by this land? And it is more than 2, so you might want to consult a regular map so you see how truly vast this area is that people were occupying. This is another view, in fact, a close-up of some of this land, especially land that was considered tribal territory of the Cheyenne and the Arapaho. And these shades of orange and yellow and green all were tribal land until the Fort Laramie Treaty was revised in this area in 1861. And in 1861, the Cheyenne and Arapaho had their territory reduced just to the green portions. The blue arrow points to the site of present-day Denver. So I want you to think not only a rough estimate of how much land the Cheyenne lost, but also what effect that land loss would have on the tribe. So the number of people isn't fewer, but their land is much less. So next we have a newspaper notice of gold discovered at Pikes Peak, Colorado in 1858. And then you also see an illustration by Alfred Bierstadt from 1859 called Crossing the Platte River. So you should be thinking about what you learned about mining and the definition of a boom town. And it's also interesting to notice how in this illustration, the artist juxtaposed the wagon train on the left with a group of Cheyenne on the right. And if you look at this additional map, and you can zoom in on it when you have a chance on your own iPads, The title is Routes to the Gold Fields. So this is showing Americans how to get to Colorado, to Pikes Peak, where the gold is. And on the far right, you can see the state of Illinois. So you see how small a scale this is. Again, this is some vast territory. And I'm going to use my cursor here. You can see that this says buffalo country, so there's a big concentration of buffalo here, and this little bit of yellow up here is where Denver is, right about there. Denver was founded in November of 1858 because of this gold rush. And the 1860 population was 4,749. So you should compare this area and where Denver is and where the buffalo fields are to the map in figure 2 showing where Denver is. And you should think about what impact the loss of buffalo is going to have. The Cheyenne become cut off from the areas where the buffalo traditionally are in this state. And if you look at your little chart down here, look at the numbers of buffalo in 1840, 1870, and the mid-1880s. What happens to the buffalo over time? Next, we're going to look at some quotes. The first quote is from Chief Blackkettle. He's a peace chief of the Southern Cheyenne. And peace chiefs are charged with negotiating, keeping the peace within the tribe and with other people, kind of like an ambassador. Here's his quote. I want you to give all these chiefs of the soldiers here to understand that we are for peace and that we have made peace, that we may not be mistaken by them for enemies. I have not come here with a little wolf bark, but I have come to plain talk with you. Although wrongs have been done to me, I live in hopes. Who is Chief Blackkettle speaking to, and what wrong do you think he's trying to say has been done to the Cheyenne? Contrast it with this quote. And quote number 2 is from the Denver City Rocky Mountain Times newspaper in the summer of 1864. The confessed murderers of the Hungate family, a man and wife and their 2 little babes, whose scalped and mutilated remains were seen by all our citizens, were the confessed participants in a score of other murders of peaceful settlers and inoffensive travelers upon our borders and along our roads in the last 6 months. The band of marauders had in their possession scores of horses and mules stolen from the government and from individuals, wagon loads of flour, coffee, sugar, and tea, and rolls of broadcloth, calico, books, etc., robbed from freighters and emigrants on the plains. First, look up the word mutilated, and then the word marauders if you don't know what those mean. But who are the marauders and murderers the article is talking about? And why would they be committing these murders? Here's your next quote. Damn any man who sympathizes with Indians. I have come to kill Indians and believe it is right and honorable to use any means under God's heaven to kill Indians. Kill and scalp all, big and little, nits make lice. Colonel John Milton Chivington. Colonel Chivington was a volunteer in the Denver City militia during the Civil War. And this was a quote from him at the time when these murderers and marauders were active on the plains. And I want you to think, do you know what nits are? Do you need to look that up? Do you know what lice are? So think about how he is describing Native peoples. The next task requires you to look at some pictures. The first picture is an artist's conception of what happened at Sand Creek, and the other pictures were drawn by Cheyenne warriors who were actually there. And you will be able to zoom in on these. And I want you to think about why the Cheyenne are flying an American flag, and what's the significance of the white flag flying with the American flag. If you don't know what a white flag symbolizes, you should look that up. And I want you to think about whether you can tell what happened at Sand Creek from these images. And then you'll have 3 short passages from the American perspective of what happened at Sand Creek. One from Colonel Shivington in his congressional testimony, one from George Bent, who was half Cheyenne, half white, and lived at Sand Creek, and one from another interpreter of Cheyenne in English who was also at Sand Creek. And the 3 of them talk about what happened there. And I want you to compare and contrast what they say with the drawings by the Cheyenne themselves. Do they all tell the same story? And when you hear what happens, and keep in mind that this happened during the Civil War, this should be enough information to get you started on looking at these documents and filling them out yourself.